Blotch control. Well, this is a subject I know a little bit about. There's a lot of different ways of controlling it. Some are good, some are bad. And I've explained this many times, but to understand what's happening is within the confines of a lot of woods, you have a soft grain and a hard grain. Obviously, the soft grain is going to absorb more than a hard grain. Thus, you get a blotch because it's taking more stain or dye than the hard grain. Now, in some cases, that's an attractive thing. In the case of this tiger maple or a flame birch or something like that, it can be quite pretty. This is just a little bit of cinnamon dye. This is this little teeny piece of curly maple. And as you can see, what happens is that the soft grain has a defined curl, and it creates a very pleasing look. Now here's the other side. This one gets a second coat of dye. Again, that's a pleasing blotch. That's all it is. It's blotching. Now, this is one of those, if you've never used yellow pine, I don't know of anything in the world any worse. When you get woods that got a lot of knots and different things in it, it goes pretty nasty pretty quick. And the longer the dye or stain sits on it, the worse it'll get, because it just kind of migrates down in there and you get this blotchy, kind of nasty looking thing. So the answer is what's called a pre-stain. Now, what is that? Well, it's a medium that's applied to the wood that attempts to solidify, or better terms, make uniform the surface. Now, there's a lot of them out there. Some of the more prominent and better known are the oil base, and General Finishes makes one, several do. What it is, and I'm not going to go through all of these because so many people's tried them. I mean, it's obvious. What these are basically linseed oil, boiled linseed oil, and what they do, the object of their game is to soak into the wood and equalize it. The problem is, in many woods, like a cherry or something, they react with the wood and they themselves can blotch it. Then when you go to put the stain over it, it blotches a little bit as well. But the main difference is that it really affects color retention. Now, with that said, any pre-stain, bar none, is going to cause the color to be lighter. And the reason for it is that the wood is being sealed to some degree. And that means it's not going to absorb as much of the color as it normally would. And it has to be that way. It's just one of those things you can't get past. Now, which one's that? Minwax has a water base, General Finishes has a water base. Both of these are basically a thin down. This is a thin down, and this is just kind of a straight up, it's a stain base, meaning it's the clear that they use for the making the stain. Do they work? To a degree. They do. They work to a degree. But they've just proven, again, I could go through here and waste a whole lot of wood and show you whatever. You feel free to try. And I don't like doing it that way, but I could spend hours on blotch control. But I'm just going to cut to the chase. We use hours. Now, I'm just going to say it like this. I didn't spend a year developing this if the others worked. I did it out of pure desperation and necessity. Now, the one I found that typically worked the best was a thin down shellac, of doing, you know, a half-pound cut of shellac or something like that. The problem I had with the shellac was twofold. One, it was never consistent. It just didn't matter. I mean, whatever I did, you know, one board I should have had a 3/4 pound cut, the other one I should have had a 1/4 pound cut, and there was just no way of knowing. So it was very hard to get a consistent, even color. But now that said, if I did a wash coat, that's what it's typically called a lot of times, of shellac, of a thin shellac, and then I sprayed the dye, then or stain, then I was okay. But there's a segment on here of, you know, spraying for blotch control, and that does help immensely. And again, using a shellac under it or whatever worked. But again, I couldn't wipe it and be consistent. And unfortunately, depending upon what you're doing, you know, particularly if you're doing, like I said, you're doing tables and you got turn legs, or you're doing chairs, or pretty much anything, it's a lot of times it's just impossible to be able to spray a dye or stain uniformly all the time. So we developed ours. What ours is it's basically some different acrylics, little glycol ethers, and yeah, there's a little bit of PVA. There's a high, we have it made, there's a high solids PVA glue in it. That's the binder. That means that's the thing that holds it all together. And acrylics and all is what does the work. Now, when we formulated it, one of the things we formulated it to do was to kind of soften a little, is for lack of a better term, under a water-based dye or stain. That meant the product itself was taking the stain. Now, does it work under an oil? Yes, it does. But one of the things that you're going to want to do is you want to test, because again, one of the things with a water-based, with the blotch control, and with any of them, is that it depends upon the amount of seal. Now, it doesn't soften under an oil base. So there's a couple things that we found that has a bearing on it. Number one, how much blotch control you put on, and two, the stain you're using. Now, there's a lot of very weak stains out here, and there's some good stains. But again, you can expect a slight variation in color. It will be lighter. So the more blotch control you have to put on, and again, we're talking oil base here, the more lighter the stain's going to be. So you have to do some test samples. One of the things we've found is with an oil base, usually, but again, you got to test. One coat's all you need. Now we recommend 2 coats, and but under the oil, a lot of times 1 coat will do it. Let's take a look at that. I got a little bit of Minwax something here, and I got a little bit of General Finishes here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a little bit of this Minwax, and on this piece of cherry, I did the top of it, I think, with 1 coat, and the bottom with nothing. And you can see the difference in color, but it's not drastic. But I'm looking, the 1 coat is pretty much doing it for the blotch. If I take the general finishes stain, which quite honestly is a little stronger and got a little bit more heavier pigment in it, I've got very little differentiation in color whatsoever. Now, one of the things that confuses me is that I see out on the forums and this and that, I see a lot of guys talking about for blotch control to use a dye. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. And the reason it doesn't make any sense is that a dye is thinner. So being thin like that, I mean, it's just going to be absorbed that much more readily. The one advantage to a dye is it'll dry quicker. Now that brings us back to the oil stains we just looked at. If you let it dry good and then come back with a second coat, usually you'll come to the color that you want. But again, you got to test it. In the case of ours, you know, again, no blotch control is without its quirks. Ours doesn't like an alcohol-based stain or dye or a lacquer. The alcohol and the lacquer solvent in it is just too strong for it. It will soften it too quick. Those need to be sprayed. Now, I didn't do this, but sit up and listen to me very carefully here. If you're using an alcohol or a lacquer-based stain, try using one coat of a good oil as a pre-stain. And I say a good oil. The ones I've used the Minwax Polywhite, Poly Oil, whatever you call it. I've used the Formbeach Tung Oil, and I've used the Armor Seal. Now, one of the other things that you're going to see in the oil-based pre-stains, like the Minwax and General Finishes, whatever, they're going to tell you to apply the stain within 2 hours. Now, the reason for that is that oil is being absorbed by the wood, and it's kind of starting to dry a little bit. So that means it's going to seal even more, or the wood's going to get absorbed into it deep enough that it's not really doing what it should do, and that's to fill up the soft grain. But they don't want it to dry. In the case of in the case of a alcohol or lacquer dye or stain, just try one coat of oil and let it dry. Now the reason that works is because the oil, even though it's dry, the thinners, the alcohol and the thinner in the lacquer is strong enough, it'll bite into it. It helps. The best way to handle them is spray it. But that has its limitations as well. So again, ours is predominant, it works under an oil, but it's predominantly designed for the water bases. Now this is unsanded, nothing done to it. It's rough. All I did was wipe a couple coats out. Blotch on the bottom of it. You see I'm a little dark around that knot. That's just because I didn't sand it at all. Versus not blotching. And that's the worst. I'm going to show you some more. Now, one of the other things that we found with ours that was kind of odd, well, I don't want to say odd, it was kind of cool actually. This is a board I glued up just for fun. I've got yellow pine, red oak, white pine, curly cherry, poplar, MDF, and mahogany. And this is where I just wiped the stain across it. It's no good reason. And then this is the side that we blotch control. Now what's kind of hard to see here because of the glare is that in reality our color, because it's being affected by each one of the various woods, but the tone of the thing is all the same. And if you look at the curly cherry right here, you see the figure. So we let the figure show. Over here in the red oak, you know, your what we call crevice grain, the deep grain in it, it's still picking up the, you know, the stain. It's just not blotching. It's just not getting dark and nasty. Now, one of the things that we found with it is that it does something else. If you're using what we call punky wood, like spalted maple or whatever the case like that, a wood that's a little soft, basswood or something like that, because of all those acrylics, it hardens the wood. It makes it a little bit more denser. It'll just soak it up and it hardens in there, and there you go. But let me grab some pieces over here and we're going to put some dye on and just let you see it.